We shall begin this evening with an exercise in disenchantment. The purpose of the following extensive compilation is to systematically dismantle, timber by timber, the romanticized edifice of the pirate legend. The figure of the swashbuckler, a product of later literary invention, bears almost no resemblance to the historical reality of the 17th century mariner who operated outside the sanction of a statespo. Sword, navy, or merchant charter, our inquiry will be methodical, perhaps to the point of tedium. For it is in the mundane and repetitive details of daily existence that the true nature of this life is revealed. We will not be concerned with grand battles or buried treasure, but with the material realities of the vesselates. Elf, the unceasing demands of labor, the biological consequences of the maritime diet and the brutal sociology of a society afloat. This is not a story, but rather a catalogue of sober and unvarnished audit of hardship. Let the sheer weight of these details be a balm, a gentle pressure that eases you away from conscious thought and toward a state of rest. We shall begin with the most immediate and inescapable aspect of life at sea, the physical environment of the ship itself. A 17th century ship was not merely a mode of transport. It was a total institution, an enclosed world that assaulted the senses without cessation. For the modern individual, accustomed to climate control, sanitation, and personal space, the initial shock of this environment would be profound and likely insurmountable. We will now examine the key sensory inputs of this environment in clinical detail. The primary and most overwhelming sensory input aboard any working vessel of this period was the smell. It was not a single odor, but a complex and potent miasma, composed of numerous distinct yet interwoven elements. To fully appreciate its impact, we must break it down into its constituent parts. The very substance that held the ship together was a primary source of its odor. The hose planks were sealed not with modern epoxies, but with oak mold, unraveled rope fibers hammered into the seams and then sealed over with hot pine tar. This tar had a sharp, acrid, and pervasive smell, which would be baked into the wood by the sun and become a permanent feature of the atmosphere. On hot days, the tar would soften, its scent intensifying, and it would stick to clothing, hands, and any unfortunate soul tasked with its application or maintenance. The lowest point of the ship's interior, the bilge, functioned as the vessel's septic system. Here, seawater that leaked through the hull and inevitability in any wooden ship would mix with spilled food, vomit, stagnant drinking water, runoff from the livestock pens, and any other form of liquid waste. This created a black, anaerobic soup that festered in the darkness. The predominant odor was of hydrogen sulfide, the smell of rotten eggs, produced by bacterial decay in an oxygen-deprived environment. This was layered with the ammoniacal stench of urine and the deeper, cloying sweetness of rot. The scent of the bilge would rise through the floorboards, a constant and nauseating reminder of the ship's internal decay. With 80 to 150 men living in extremely close quarters, with limited access to fresh water for washing, the smell of unwashed bodies was a simple fact of life. This was compounded by diseases like dysentery, the bloody flux, and the inherent difficulties of sanitation. The heads, as the toilet facilities were known, were typically located at the bow of the ship, consisting of little more than a seat or grating over the open water in heavy seas. Their use was perilous, and facilities were always inadequate for the number of crew, leading to contamination of nearby areas. To supplement the monotonous diet of salted meat and hardtack, many ships carried live animals, chickens, goats, and pigs would be kept in pens on the main deck. Their waste, combined with the smell of the animals themselves, would add another layer to the olfactory tapestry. Particularly downwind, even properly stored provisions had a distinct smell. The dusty, musty scent of barrels of flour and biscuit, the intensely saline aroma of salted beef, and the fermented, vinegary smell of beer and grog were all present. When these stores began to rot, as they inevitably did, they introduced the new sense of mold, mildew, and decomposition. The combination of these elements created an atmosphere that was not merely unpleasant, but thick and almost tangible. It was a smell that one would taste at the back of the throat, a permanent feature of existence from which there was absolutely no escape. Silence was a state that did not exist at sea. The ship was a living entity, and it vocalized its existence through a constant symphony of stress and motion. The most pervasive sound was the creaking of the ship's timbers. This was not a uniform sound. The deep, groaning bass notes came from the main keel and ribs under torsional stress in a heavy swell. Higher-pitched creaks and squeals emanated from the deck planks as they flexed under the weight of men and equipment. The masts would produce their own unique groans as the wind pushed against the sails, transferring immense pressure down into the ship's hull. Each type of wood, from the English oak of the frame to the Baltic pine of the masts, would have its own sonic signature. The wind itself was a constant auditory presence, whizzing and humming through the complex web of ropes and stays that constituted the rigging. This sound would rise and fall in pitch and intensity with the speed of the wind, the great canvas. Sails, when catching the wind, would produce a powerful, low-thrumming sound. When the ship changed course or came about, the sails would momentarily lose the wind and flog, creating a series of explosive cracks like gunshots that would reverberate across the deck. The sound of water was omnipresent. The gentle lapping against the hull in a calm sea would give way to a constant, rushing hiss as the ship gained speed. In rougher seas, waves would slap and pound against the bow with concussive force, sending vibrations through the entire vessel. Water washing over the main deck would create a chaotic sloshing and draining sound, superimposed. On these environmental sounds were the noises of the ship's operation, the rhythmic clanking of the bilge pump, the heavy scrape of holystones on the deck, the shouted orders of the boatswain and other officers, the collective grunting of men hauling on a line, and the sharp metallic sounds of the smith or carpenter making repairs all contributed to a constant industrial din. There was no soundproofing, no acoustic insulation. Every sound traveled, creating a taxing and unrelenting auditory environment. The operation of a 17th century sailing vessel was an exercise in continuous, labor-intensive maintenance. The romantic image of pirates lounging on deck awaiting a prize is a fallacy. Idleness was a luxury the ship itself could not afford. The vessel was a complex machine in a constant state of decay, and only through the relentless application of human energy could it be kept functional. The motive force of the ship was its rigging and sails, a system that demanded constant, skilled attention. The ropes were not modern synthetic polymers, but organic fibers, primarily hemp. Hemp rope was strong, but highly susceptible to rot, especially in the marine environment. To combat this, all standing rigging, the ropes that held the masts in place had to be regularly coated or slushed with a protective mixture. This was typically a foul combination of tar, sulfur, and animal fat, which had to be heated and applied by hand. The running rigging the ropes used to control the sails had to remain flexible and was therefore more vulnerable. A constant task for the crew was the inspection and replacement of frayed or rotting lines. This was the most dangerous and physically demanding work on the ship. Sailors known as taut men would have to climb high into the masts, often over 100 feet above the deck, using only a series of ropes, the shrouds and ratlines as a ladder. They performed this work in all weather conditions on a platform that was swaying, pitching, and rolling violently. Their tasks included furling the heavy canvas sails in a rising storm, a process that involved lying out on the yardarms, the horizontal spars, and fighting to control the flocking canvas. They also had to replace damaged spars, re-thread ropes through blocks and pulleys, and act as lookouts. A fall from this height meant certain death. The sails were made of heavy flax canvas, and they were frequently damaged by high winds or combat. Repair was not a simple task. A large sail could weigh several 100 pounds and had to be lowered to the deck, the sailmakers, using specialized needles, a protective leather palm worn on the hand, and waxed thread, would painstakingly stitch patches over the damaged areas. In a long voyage, this was a near constant occupation for a portion of the crew. The wooden hull and deck were the skin of the vessel, protecting the interior from the sea. Their integrity was paramount. The decks were not merely scrubbed for cleanliness, but were scoured to prevent them from becoming slick with algae and grime, which could be dangerously slippery. The primary method was holystoning. This involved using large blocks of sandstone, also called Bibles, as they forced the men to their knees to scour the planks. Seawater and sand were used as an abrasive. It was slow, back-breaking work, performed for hours on end, leaving the men with raw knuckles and aching backs. Below the waterline, the ship's hull was under constant attack from the elements and marine life. Barnacles and seaweed would accumulate, creating drag and slowing the vessel significantly. More dangerous were the trado worms, or shipworms, which were not worms but a type of mollusk that would bore long tunnels through the wooden planks. Capable of structurally compromising a ship over time, to combat this, a ship had to be periodically cleaned. The vessel would be sailed to a calm, shallow bay and emptied of all cannon, ballast, and stores, using ropes and tackles attached to the masts. The crew would then haul the ship over onto its side, exposing one half of the hull. They would then have to scrape off all the marine growth. Foul-smelling and laborious task. The exposed timber would then be graved, or coated with a new layer of the protective tar and fat mixture, before the ship was righted and the process repeated on the other side. This was a monumental undertaking that could take a week or more, during which the ship was completely vulnerable. The logistical challenges of provisioning a vessel for a voyage of many months with 17th century technology were immense. The resulting diet was not designed for health or pleasure, but for caloric content and resistance to spoilage. This led to a monotonous and nutritionally deficient regimen that was a direct cause of widespread disease. The single most important food item was the ship's biscuit, colloquially known as hardtack. The biscuit was a simple mixture of flour, water, and occasionally salt. It contained no leavening agent. The dough was rolled out and baked at a low temperature for separate times. This process drove out nearly all moisture, creating a product that was incredibly dense, hard, and resistant to mold. Its primary virtue was its longevity. It could, in theory, remain edible for years. In practice, edible was a relative term. Hardtack was so hard that it was nearly impossible to bite into without risk of cracking a tooth. It had to be soaked in water, beer, or stew to soften it into a more manageable, if bland, pulp. The primary problem, however, was infestation. The barrels of biscuit were an ideal breeding ground for insects. The most common inhabitants were a type of beetle known as the biscuit weevil Stegobium. Panaceum. Sailors would tap the biscuits on the table before eating to dislodge the adult weevils. But the larvae, baked deep within the biscuit's pores, were often consumed unknowingly. This was so common that it was largely accepted as an unavoidable feature of the diet. The primary source of protein at sea was meat preserved through heavy salting. The preservation process. Beef and pork were the most common meats used. The meat was cut into pieces and packed into wooden barrels, with thick layers of coarse salt packed in between each layer of meat. The salt would draw the moisture out of the meat through osmosis, creating a brine in which bacteria could not easily multiply. This process was effective at preventing spoilage, but had a dramatic effect on the meat itself. Quality and palatability. The salting process rendered the meat incredibly tough, stringy, and intensely salty. Before it could be eaten, it had to be soaked in fresh water for several hours, a process that was often neglected or shortened due to the rationing of fresh water. Even after soaking, the meat, known as salt junk or salt horse, was notoriously unpalatable. It was typically boiled for hours to make it tender enough to chew, often as part of a one-pot stew called lobscouse, which would be bulked out with crumbled hardtack and whatever root vegetables might still be available. The quality of the meat to begin with was often very poor, sourced from the cheapest and oldest animals. Old naval stories, likely apocryphal but illustrative of the meat's toughness, tell of sailors carving decorative objects from pieces of salt junk. Access to potable water was one of the most critical logistical challenges of any long sea voyage. Water storage and contamination. Fresh water was stored in wooden casks. These casks were rarely perfectly watertight and were themselves a source of contamination. Over weeks and months, the water would become stagnant and foul. Algae and slime would grow on the inside of the casks, turning the water green or brown and giving it a slick, unpleasant texture and a swampy taste. This cask water was a breeding ground for bacteria, making it a vector for diseases like dysentery and typhoid. The role of alcoholic beverages to combat the poor quality of the water and to provide additional calories. Sailors were allotted a daily ration of alcohol. This was most commonly beer or ale. In the early stages of a voyage, small beer a week, low alcohol beer was the standard drink, with a typical ration being a gallon per man per day. It was hydrating and, due to the brewing process, safer to drink than the stored water. However, beer also spoiled as the voyage progressed and the beer turned sour. The crew would switch to harder spirits. Rum, being a compact and stable byproduct of Caribbean sugar production, became increasingly popular. The practice of mixing rum with water to create grog served all purposes. It diluted the scent. O&G spirit encouraged hydration. The alcohol helped to mask the foul taste of the cask water. The monotonous diet of preserved foods was critically deficient in several key micronutrients, most notably ascorbic acid, or vitamin C. This deficiency led to the single most feared disease of the age of sail, scurvy. Etiology and onset. Scurvy is a disease of collagen synthesis. Vitamin C is essential for the production of collagen, the protein vital for the integrity of connective tissue throughout the body. Without it, the body's ability to repair itself effectively ceases. Symptoms typically began to appear after 1 to 3 months at sea. Clinical progression. The initial symptoms were often vague. Lethargy, fatigue, and aching limbs, easily mistaken for the general rigors of life at sea. This was followed by more specific and alarming signs. The gums would become swollen, purple, and spongy, bleeding at the slightest touch. The teeth would loosen in their sockets and eventually fall out. Pinpoint bleeding would appear on the skin petechiae, particularly on the legs, which could coalesce into large, dark bruises. Old, healed wounds would mysteriously reopen and refuse to close. The joints would swell painfully, making movement difficult. Terminal stages. In its advanced stages, scurvy was horrific. Sufferers experienced extreme exhaustion, fever, convulsions, and eventually fatal internal hemorrhaging. Death from scurvy was a slow, painful, and demoralizing process that could claim a significant portion of a ship's crew on any long voyage. While the cure fresh fruit and vegetables was simple, the link was not yet clinically understood in the 17th century, making scurvy a terrifying and seemingly unavoidable consequence of life at sea. A pirate ship was a unique social experiment, a self-governing, isolated community of men, often from desperate backgrounds, engaged in a high-risk criminal enterprise. The social structures and psychological pressures that resulted were unlike those found anywhere else, contrary to the image of lawless anarchy. Most pirate vessels operated under a strict set of written rules, known as the ship's articles or pirate code. Formation of the articles. Upon forming a crew, a set of articles would be drawn up and agreed upon by all members. Each man would be required to sign or make his mark on the document, signifying his consent to be governed by its terms. This was a form of social contract, establishing rules for the distribution of plunder, the duties of the crew, and the punishments for infractions. Common articles. While codes varied from ship to ship, they often contained similar provisions. These included rules for the fair distribution of booty, with the captain and quartermaster typically receiving larger shares compensation for injuries sustained in battle. A specific sum for the loss of a limb or an early form of workman's compensation, and prohibitions against fighting on board the ship. Disputes were to be settled ashore with pistols or cutlasses. Forms of punishment. Justice was swift and brutal. For minor offenses, the most common punishment was flogging with the cato, 9 tails. For more serious crimes, such as desertion, cowardice, or theft from a fellow crewman, the punishments were more severe. Marooning was a common sentence, where the offender was abandoned on a deserted island with minimal supplies. The most extreme punishment, reserved for the gravest offenses, was execution, typically by hanging from the yardarm or simply being shot. The enforcement of this justice was often the responsibility of the quartermaster, who acted as a check on the captain's power. Life at sea was an exercise in managing profound psychological stress, stemming from the unique conditions of the environment. Absence of privacy. The complete lack of personal space was a significant psychological burden. Every act, from eating to sleeping, was performed in the immediate presence of others. There was no solitude, no place for quiet contemplation or private grief. This constant, enforced social contact could be intensely grating, turning minor personal habits and annoyances into major sources of conflict. The inability to ever truly be alone would be, for many, a slow and maddening form of torture. The duality of boredom and terror. A sailor's life oscillated between two extreme states: long periods of mind-numbing boredom and short bursts of intense, life-threatening terror. The vast majority of time at sea was spent engaged in repetitive, monotonous labor under an unchanging sky. Weeks could pass with no sight of land or another ship. This tedium was punctuated by moments of extreme danger, such as a sudden storm that threatened to tear the ship apart, or the chaos of combat. This hurry-up-and-wait cycle could be psychologically jarring and emotionally exhausting. Latent interpersonal conflict, the combination of confinement, boredom, physical discomfort, and the presence of a large group of men with often volatile temperaments created a fertile ground for control. ICT. While the articles forbade fighting on board, tensions constantly simmered beneath the surface. Grudges over perceived slights, disputes over gambling, or arguments fueled by alcohol could easily fester in the cramped conditions. Every man knew that his survival depended on the competence and cooperation of his shipmates, yet the environment itself bred suspicion and antagonism. This created a persistent, low-level anxiety, a need to be constantly wary of the moods and intentions of those round you. The ultimate purpose of a pirate vessel was the violent acquisition of property. The realities of this violence were far removed from the choreographed sword fights of popular fiction. It was a brutal, noisy, and deeply traumatizing affair, with rudimentary medical care that often made injuries worse. An attack on the merchant vessel was a carefully calculated, multi-stage process designed to intimidate the target into surrender with minimal risk to the attacking crew. The chase and the warning shot. The engagement began with a chase. Once in range, a warning shot would be fired across the bow of the target vessel. This was a clear signal of intent. The goal was to force a surrender without a fight, as a prolonged battle risked damaging the prize and injuring the pirate crew. The cannonade, if the target chose to resist, the engagement would escalate to a full cannonade. The primary purpose of cannon fire was not to sink the ship, but to incapacitate the crew and destroy the ship's ability to maneuver or fight back. The weapon of choice was anti-personnel shot. Instead of a single solid cannonball, the cannons would be loaded with chain shot to smaller balls linked by a chain, designed to scythe through rigging. Or grape shot, a canvas bag filled with dozens of small iron balls that would spray out like a massive shotgun blast. The noise of a broadside was thunderous and concussive. The air would fill with thick, black, sulphurous smoke, obscuring vision and making it difficult to breathe. Splinter damage. The most significant source of casualties was not the cannonballs themselves, but the splinters they created. When a heavy iron ball struck the thick oak hull of a ship, it would send thousands of wooden shards, from the size of a toothpick to the size of a spear, flying across the deck at lethal velocity. These splinters caused horrific penetrating and impalement injuries. Boarding and close quarters combat. If the target was sufficiently disabled, the final stage was boarding. Grappling hooks would be thrown to lash the ships together. The pirates would then swarm aboard, creating chaos and panic. The fighting was not elegant swordplay, but brutal. Close quarters butchery with heavy cutlasses, axes, and flintlock pistols. The objective was to overwhelm the defenders through sheer ferocity and numbers. Medical care aboard a 17th century ship was primitive at best. The ship's surgeon was often a man with no formal medical training, such as the carpenter or cook, chosen for his strong stomach and familiarity with saws. Types of trauma. Wounds from combat were severe. They included deep lacerations from cutlasses, penetrating trauma from splinters and musket balls, and massive crush injuries and compound fractures from falling spars or mishandled cannons. Burns from gunpowder explosions were also common. Amputation is a primary procedure for any severe injury to a limb, such as a compound fracture or a joint shattered by a musket ball. Amputation was the only viable treatment. There was no concept of sterile procedure and no anesthetic. The patient, often fortified with a large dose of rum, would be held down by several men. The surgeon would use a simple hacksaw to cut through the flesh and bone as quickly as possible. The screaming of the patient would be audible throughout the ship. Hemostasis and wound dressing. To stop the bleeding from the amputation stump, the surgeon would employ a cautery iron, a piece of metal heated in the galley's fire until it was red hot, and press it against the open wound to seal the blood vessels. Alternatively, the stump might be dipped in hot tar. For other wounds, the primary treatment was to probe for foreign bodies like musket balls or splinters. Wash the wound with wine or seawater, and then pack it with lint and a simple bandage. The inevitability of infection, given the complete lack of sanitation and understanding of germ theory, nearly every major wound became infected. Gangrene, tetanus lockjaw, and sepsis were rampant. A man might survive the initial injury and the surgeon saw, only to die a slow, agonizing death from infection days or weeks later, the chances of surviving a serious combat. Injury were exceptionally low. The ultimate motivation for enduring these hardships was the pursuit of wealth. However, the economic reality of piracy was far from the fantasy of chests overflowing with gold coins. It was a precarious and often disappointing enterprise, governed by its own logistical and financial challenges. The democratic structure of a pirate crew extended to the division of loot, which was meticulously outlined in the ship's articles. The share system, unlike a naval or merchant vessel where men received a fixed wage. Pirates operated on a commission basis, known as the share system. Each successful capture would result in the plunder being valued and divided into a set number of shares. A standard crewman would receive one full share. Hierarchical distribution, officers and skilled specialists received more than a single share. The captain might be allotted 2 or 2.5 shares in recognition of his leadership and the risks he bore. The quartermaster, who held significant authority in day-to-day matters, often received 1.5 or 2 shares. Other skilled men, such as the ship's surgeon, carpenter, or master gunner, would also be awarded a 1.25 or a 1.5. This system was considered far more equitable than the wage system of legitimate shipping and was a major incentive for men to go on the account. The common stock and injury compensation before the shares were distributed. A portion of the plunder was set aside for the ship's common fund, used to purchase ammunition, powder, and provisions. Another portion was allocated for the injury compensation fund, as stipulated in the articles. A man who lost an arm in battle might receive a payment of 500 or 600 pieces of 8 before the general day. Evasion, ensuring that even the maimed received some reward for their sacrifice. The popular image of pirates burying chests of gold and jewels is largely a myth. While pirates certainly sought out hard currency, Spanish pieces of 8 being the most desirable, the vast majority of their plunder consisted of mundane commercial goods. Typical cargo. The cargo of a typical merchant vessel in the Atlantic or Caribbean would consist of bulk commodities. These included barrels of sugar, molasses, indigo dye, flour, tobacco, and wine, bolts of cloth like silk and calico, and practical supplies like rope, sailcloth, anchors, and tools. While valuable in aggregate, these were not the easily portable riches of legend. Logistical challenges. This presented a logistical problem. A pirate ship had limited cargo space. Taking on barrels of flour or wine meant sacrificing space for their own provisions and water. The pirates had to make a pragmatic calculation about which goods were most valuable by weight and volume, and which could be most easily sold, often after taking what they could. The captured merchant vessel and its remaining cargo would simply be scuttled or burned. Acquiring stolen goods was only half the battle. The pirates then had to convert this plunder into spendable cash. This required access to corrupt merchants and ports that were willing to turn a blind eye to the origins of the goods. Pirate havens, ports like Port Royal in Jamaica in its heyday, Nassau on New Providence Island, and certain coves in Madagascar became notorious pirate havens. These towns developed entire economies based on fencing stolen goods, and scrupulous merchants and tavern keepers would buy pirate plunder at a fraction of its market value. The discount market. Pirates were in a poor negotiating position. They needed to offload their goods quickly before colonial authorities could intervene. They were selling illegal merchandise and had few other options. As a result, merchants could drive a hard bargain. A bolt of silk or a barrel of sugar that was worth a significant sum in London or Boston would be sold for a much lower price in a pirate port. Even when a pirate crew made a successful haul and liquidated their goods, the wealth was almost always fleeting. The lifestyle of pirates ashore was one of explosive and short-lived excess. Immediate gratification after months of hardship, deprivation and danger at sea, pirates reaching port sought immediate and overwhelming gratification. Their earnings were spent with astonishing speed in the taverns, gambling dens, and brothels that flourished in pirate havens. Eyewitness accounts from the period describe pirates spending hundreds of pieces of 8 in a single night, buying drinks for the entire tavern, showering courtesans with money, and engaging in reckless gambling. The inevitable return to sea, this profligate spending meant that even a substantial share from a prize would be exhausted in a matter of days or weeks. With their money gone, and with no other trade or skill, the pirates had little choice but to sign on for another voyage. This created a continuous cycle of hardship at sea followed by brief, frantic excess ashore, ensuring that very few pirates ever achieved long-term financial security or a peaceful retirement. The pirate's life was not a path to riches, but a perpetual loop of risk and fleeting reward, ending almost invariably in poverty or a violent death. Beyond the internal hardships of the vessel and its crew, the pirate existed in a world of profound and implacable external dangers. These threats came from two primary sources: the unpredictable violence of the natural world and the organized, systematic violence of the state. The Caribbean, the primary hunting ground for pirates, is also the theater for one of nature's most destructive phenomena, the hurricane, for a 17th century wooden sailing ship. An encounter with a major storm was often a final one, absence of forecasting. With no meteorological science, a storm's approach was heralded only by a darkening sky, a change in the swell, and a rapid drop in barometric pressure, which could only be felt, not measured. A ship could be caught with little to no warning. The physical experience, as the storm hit, the ship would become a toy in the grip of unimaginable forces. The wind, howling at speeds exceeding 100 miles per hour, would shred even the smallest storm sails and could snap masts made of solid timber. Mountainous waves would crash over the vessel, sweeping anything and anyone not securely lashed down into the sea. The ship would be thrown on its side, or on its beam ends, risking catastrophic flooding through the deck hatches. Below deck was a scene of chaos men, barrels and loose equipment thrown about in the darkness as the ship's timbers groaned under the strain, threatening to break apart at any moment. Survival and aftermath. Survival was a matter of luck and the structural integrity of the ship. A vessel that survived a hurricane was often left dismasted and helpless, adrift at the mercy of the currents. For many pirate crews, their final entry in the log of history was simply lost at sea, there and unrecorded, their ship and all hands vanishing without a trace beneath the waves. The same complex coastlines, shallow bays, and numerous islands that made the Caribbean an ideal place to hide also made it an exceptionally dangerous place to navigate. Rudimentary cartography. Navigational charts of the 17th century were notoriously inaccurate and incomplete. They were often based on anecdotal reports and lacked the precision of modern hydrographic surveys. A reef or sandbar that could tear the bottom out of a ship might be entirely absent from a chart, or misplaced by miles. The act of sounding. To navigate in coastal waters, sailors relied on sounding with a lead line. This was a length of rope with a lead weight at the end, which had a hollowed-out bottom filled with tallow or wax. A sailor would cast the line ahead of the ship, and when the lead hit the bottom, he would note the depth from markers on the rope and the type of material that stuck to the tallow: sand, mud, shells, giving the navigator clues about their location. This was a slow, repetitive, and imprecise process. Grounding. Running aground on a reef or shoal was a common and often fatal disaster. The ship would come to a sudden, violent halt. often causing the masts to snap and fall. The hull could be breached, leading to rapid flooding. If the ship could not be pulled free by its own anchors or by lightening its load, it would be slowly broken apart by the action of the waves, leaving the crew stranded often hundreds of miles. From any friendly port, the golden age of piracy was, in reality, a brief period of a few decades, when the European powers were too preoccupied with their own wars to effectively police their colonial sea lanes. Once these conflicts subsided, the full might of institutional navies, particularly Britain's Royal Navy, was turned against the pirates. Naval patrols and pirate hunters, the British government began deploying naval frigates and sloops of war on dedicated anti-piracy patrols. These were fast, well-armed vessels commanded by professional naval officers, such as the famous Odysseus Rogers, who was appointed governor of the Bahamas with the explicit mission to stamp out the pirate nest. At Nassau, loss of havens, the systematic campaign against pirates involved not just hunting them at sea, but closing down their bases of operation. Ports that had once welcomed pirates and fenced their goods were brought under firm government control. The flow of plunder was choked off at its source, making the pirate business model untenable. The king's pardon, alongside the stick, the state also offered a carrot. Royal pardons were periodically offered to any pirate who would willingly surrender and renounce his criminal ways. This created division and suspicion within pirate crews, as men weighed the dwindling chances of a big score against the promise of a clean slate. Many famous pirates, including Benjamin Hornigold, accepted the pardon and even turned to hunting their former comrades. The inevitable end, trapped between the indifferent violence of the sea and the organized violence of the Royal Navy, the pirates' world shrank, hunted at sea, and with no safe port to run to. Capture became an inevitability. The Golden Age did not fade away. It was systematically and ruthlessly extinguished, bringing the era of widespread piracy in the Americas to a definitive close. To fully comprehend the precariousness of the pirates' existence, one must understand their unique and unenviable position within the framework of international law. Their final end, should they be captured, was almost certain to be a public and ignominious one. In legal terms, pirates were classified under the ancient Roman doctrine of hostis humani generis, which translates to enemy of all mankind. Legal implications: this classification was unique. It meant that pirates were not considered citizens of any nation, nor were they afforded the protections of any national law. They were stateless criminals. Consequently, any nation had the legal right to hunt, capture, try, and execute them, regardless of where the pirates came from or where their crimes were committed. A French pirate captured by a British naval vessel in Spanish waters could be legally tried and hanged by the British, suspension of wartime protections. Furthermore, this status meant that pirates were not considered legitimate combatants during a declared war. A captured sailor or soldier from an enemy navy would be treated as a prisoner of war, entitled to humane treatment and eventual exchange. A captured pirate, however, had no such rights. They were common criminals, and their actions were considered robbery and murder, not legitimate acts of war. This distinction was critical, as it stripped away any legal shield they might have otherwise claimed when pirates were captured. They were not typically tried in common law courts. Instead, their fate was decided by special admiralty courts, which had jurisdiction over maritime affairs. The trials in admiralty courts were swift and decisive. The evidence against pirates was often overwhelming. They were captured on a vessel armed for piracy, far from any legitimate trade route, and often the testimony of their liberated former captives was damning. The legal proceedings were a formality, the outcome a near certainty. The sentence, The mandatory sentence for a conviction of piracy was death by hanging. There was no possibility of appeal, no lesser sentence. The judgment was final and was intended to be a stark deterrent to others who might consider. Life of piracy. The final act of a pirate's life was designed to be a powerful and gruesome public. Spectacle. Execution dock. In London, convicted pirates were marched from prison to execution dock in Wapping, a specific site on the banks of the River Thames. The execution was timed to occur at low tide. The condemned were hanged, but often with a shorter rope than usual, which prevented the neck from breaking instantly and resulted in a slower, more visible death by strangulation. A dangling in the chains, the punishment did not end with death. The bodies of particularly notorious pirate captains were often subjected to a post-mortem practice known as gibbeting. The corpse would be coated in tar to preserve it, and then placed in a custom-fitted iron cage, or gibbet. This cage was then hung from a prominent headland at the entrance to a major port, such as Execution Dock in London or Gallows Point in Port Royal, Jamaica. The purpose of the gibbet. The body would be left dangling in the chains for years, a slow and gruesome process of decay visible to every ship entering or leaving a harbor. It served as a constant, unambiguous, and rotting warning from the state. It was the ultimate symbol of the Admiralty's power and a visceral reminder of the inevitable end. Ignominious end that awaited any who dared to declare themselves an enemy of all mankind. It was the final and most enduring hardship of the pirate's life. To accurately contextualize the choice to become a pirate, it is necessary to examine the available alternatives for a common seaman in the 17th and early 18th centuries. The decision to go on the account was rarely made in a vacuum. It was most often a reaction to the extreme hardships inherent in other forms of maritime labor. Piracy, for all its terrors, was often perceived as the least terrible option among a slate of grim possibilities. Service in a state navy, particularly Britain's Royal Navy, represented one of the primary alternatives to piracy. While it offered a veneer of legitimacy, it was a life of profound oppression. The role of impressment. A significant portion of naval crews consisted of men who had been impressed or forced into service. Press gangs, operating with legal authority, would roam port towns, seizing able-bodied men from taverns, streets, and even from inbound merchant ships. These men were taken against their will and forced to serve on naval vessels for years at a time, with no legal recourse. This practice made naval service akin to a sentence of penal servitude. Discipline and punishment. Discipline in the Navy was absolute and draconian. The captain of a naval vessel held the power of life and death over his crew. The slightest infraction in subordination, neglect of duty, drunkenness was met with immediate and brutal punishment. Flogging with the catto, nine tails was a routine disciplinary tool, far more common and often more severe than on pirate ships. The rigid, top-down hierarchy allowed for no dissent or negotiation, a stark contrast to the democratic structure of a pirate crew. Pay and conditions. While technically paid a wage, a naval seaman's earnings were meager and often illusory. Pay was frequently in arrears by months or even years. Furthermore, numerous deductions were made for slop's clothing, bedding, and medical care. The food was of the same poor quality as on any long-distance vessel, but rations could be withheld as punishment. The work was just as hard, and the danger from storms and combat was just as great. But it was all endured without the pirate's central motivation, a share in the profits. Service in the merchant marine was the most common maritime occupation and the primary recruiting pool for pirates. Economic vulnerability. The life of a merchant sailor was one of low pay and little security. Captains and ship owners sought to maximize profits by keeping crew costs to a minimum. Sailors were often paid only at the conclusion of a voyage, and if the ship was lost or the cargo spoiled. They might receive nothing. The work was grueling, as merchant ships often sailed with the smallest possible crews to save money. Defenselessness. Merchant vessels were typically lightly armed and crewed, making them easy prey for pirates, privateers, and enemy warships. When attacked, merchant sailors faced a grim choice: resist and risk being killed in a one-sided fight, or surrender and face an uncertain fate. If captured by pirates, they might be forced to join the pirate crew, their previous life of toil simply exchanged for a new, more criminal one. The high probability of being captured and forced onto a pirate ship provided many a convenient excuse for making a choice they may have already been contemplating. Monotony and lack of agency. Unlike naval service, there was no glory in merchant sailing, and unlike piracy, there was no promise of a sudden windfall. It was a life of monotonous, repetitive labor for the profit of others. The conditions, food, and dangers were all present, but without the democratic voice or share system that gave pirates a sense of control over their own destiny. Privateering represents the gray area between legal seamanship and outright piracy. The letter of marque, a privateer, was a privately owned vessel that was granted a letter of marque by a national government during wartime. This document authorized the captain to attack and capture ships belonging to enemy nations. In essence, it was a license for state-sanctioned piracy. Similarities to piracy. In operation, a privateer vessel was almost identical to a pirate ship. It was crewed by volunteers who signed on for a share of the plunder, not a wage. They attacked merchant shipping with the goal of capturing valuable cargo. The social structure on board was often less hierarchical than a naval vessel and focused on profit. The veneer of legality, the critical difference was the letter of marque. This document meant that, in the eyes of their own government, their actions were legal. If captured by the enemy nation, they were authorized to attack. They were to be treated as prisoners of war, not as pirates. However, this protection was then to a neutral nation or to the nation being preyed upon. They were functionally identical to pirates. Moreover, the temptation to exceed the terms of their commission, for instance, by attacking a neutral ship with a rich cargo, was immense. The transition to piracy, the greatest problem, rose when wars ended. When peace treaties were signed, or letters of marque were instantly rendered void. Suddenly, thousands of armed, unemployed privateersmen were afloat with ships built for predation, not trade. With their legal sanction gone, many simply continued their activities, making the small but significant transition from privateer to full-blown pirate. Many of the most famous pirate captains of the Golden Age began their careers as privateers. Life aboard a vessel was not anarchic. It was rigorously structured, dictated by the needs of the ship and the unforgiving cycle of the sun and stars. The 24-hour day was meticulously divided, and every man had a specific and essential function within this rigid framework to ensure the ship was manned and operational at all times. The crew was divided into watches. The two-watch system, the most common system, divided the crew into two halves, the larboard later port watch and the starboard watch, typically led by the first and second mates, respectively. These watches would alternate, serving for hours on duty, followed by 4 hours off. This cycle was a relentless grind. A 4-hour period of intense labor or vigilance was followed by a 4-hour period for sleep, meals, and personal maintenance, which was never truly enough to feel fully rested. A man might work from 4 o'clock a.m. to 8 o'clock a.m., rest until noon, work from noon to 4 p.m., and so on, perpetually fatigued. The dog watches, to prevent the same watch from being stuck with the same undesirable hours day after day, a clever modification was made to the evening watch. The watch running from 4 p.m. to 8 p.m. was split into two shorter, 2-hour dog watches, one from 4 p.m. to 6 p.m., and another from 6 p.m. to 8 p.m. This created an odd number of watches, 7, instead of 6 in a 24-hour period, meaning the watch schedule would alternate each day. The man who had the dreaded graveyard watch from midnight to 4 o'clock a.m. on Tuesday would not have it again on Wednesday. Keeping time. Time was kept by a ship's bell, which was rung every half hour of the 4-hour watch. The watch began with the turning of a 30-minute sandglass. When the sand ran out, the bell was struck once. After the next 30 minutes, it was struck twice, and so on. Update bells, which marked the end of the 4-hour watch. This constant, monotonous chimming was the inescapable clock that governed every aspect of a sailor's life. Beyond the command structure of the captain and quartermaster, a successful vessel relied on a number of skilled specialists who performed critical functions. The boatswain bosun. The boatswain was the master of all things related to the deck, rigging, and sails. He was a senior, EXPEINCED seaman responsible for the day-to-day maintenance of the ship's hardware. He would oversee the inspection of ropes, blocks, and anchors, and would direct the crew in tasks like tarring the rigging or mending sails. He was a foreman, a master rigger who knew every rope and its purpose by heart. His call, a high-pitched whistle known as a boatswain's pipe, was used to signal commands across the noisy deck. The carpenter, the ship's carpenter, was one of its most vital crew members. He was responsible for the structural integrity of the wooden hull itself. He would constantly be checking for leaks, repairing damaged planks, and strengthening the ship's frame. In combat, his role was critical. He and his mates would rush to plug holes smashed in the hull by cannonballs, often working below the waterline in perilous conditions. The carpenter's tool chest, with its saws, adzes, augers, and hammers, was among the ship's most valuable assets. He was also, by default, the primary surgeon for amputations, as he possessed the necessary saws. The cooper's domain was the barrel. On a ship where nearly all provisions, water, beer, salted meat, biscuit, gunpowder were stored in wooden casks, the cooper's role was essential. He was responsible for assembling and repairing these barrels. A leaking water cask could doom a voyage, while a poorly sealed gunpowder barrel could lead to a catastrophic explosion. The cooper had to be a master of his craft, able to shape staves and fit iron hoops to create a perfectly watertight container. The master gunner. The gunner was in charge of the ship's artillery. He was responsible for the maintenance of the cannons, ensuring the barrels were kept clean and the wooden carriages were in good repair. He oversaw the magazine, the secure room where the gunpowder was stored, and was responsible for carefully rationing powder and shot. In battle, the gunner directed the cannon crews, choosing the correct type of shot, aiming the guns, and giving the order to fire. His skill could mean the difference between a quick victory and a long, bloody defeat. Our exhaustive audit of the maritime experience in the 17th century has now drawn to a close. We have catalogued, in deliberate and perhaps soporific detail, the multifaceted hardships that define this existence. We have analyzed the foul sensory environment of the vessel itself, a world of perpetual dampness, noise, and stench. We have documented the unceasing and perilous labor required to simply keep the wooden machine afloat and moving. We have dissected the monotonous, nutritionally barren diet that led inevitably to deficiency and disease. We have examined the unique social structure of fragile democracy born of desperation, rife with tension and governed by a brutal, expedient justice. We have walked through the mechanics of combat and the primitive, agonizing state of medicine that made nearly every serious one a death sentence. We have reviewed the precarious economics of plunder, a system that promised riches but delivered almost universally to a cycle of profligacy and destitution. We have charted the external threats, from the blind fury of a hurricane to the cold, systematic wrath of the state. We have understood the pirate's legal designation as an enemy of all mankind, and the grim, public spectacle of his final end. Finally, we have placed this life in its proper context, finding it to be not a romantic choice for freedom, but a desperate flight from the nearly equal miseries of naval impressment or merchant servitude. The pirate's life was not a life of liberty. It was a life lived in a cramped, foul-smelling, wooden cage surrounded by sickness, violence, and the constant probability of a miserable end. The choice was not between tyranny and freedom, but between different forms of hardship. The pirate merely chose the hardship that came with a vote and a chance, however slim, at a price. Let this final, detailed accounting of misery now serve its purpose. Let the weight of these historical facts press down gently upon your consciousness. There is no adventure here, no romance, only a litany of struggle. And in this litany, there is a quietness. Release yourself to it. The audit is complete, the work is done, and now you may rest.